So you've probably heard HDR, or you've seen the setting on your iPhone or your phone camera, and you've probably wondered, what is an HDR photo? So these are some examples of professional HDR photographs, high dynamic range photographs. And what that really means is it's photography that exceeds the normal range of human vision. So usually there's sort of middle exposure pictures. These are like ultra high contrast pictures that have data from all of the color spectrum and all of the light spectrum. How these are taken is it's actually a series of photographs. The number of photographs changes dependent on the process, but it's actually a series of photographs that are all kind of stacked together. So in this example, this might be a 3 photograph HDR. So you've taken a photograph that is really dark, so it's at -2 exposure. You've taken a photograph at 0 exposure, right in the middle, and you've taken a photograph really bright at +2 exposure. And then you plug them into a computer or even on your camera or on your phone. It takes those 3 photos and it stacks them on top of each other to create this high dynamic range where you have really bright areas and really dark areas without any sort of data loss or loss of quality in the shadows. This is another great example of some HDR photography. We can see how beautiful and intense the sky is, right? None of that gets lost whenever we shoot HDR. HDR is hyper popular for landscapes. It is not popular for portraits. It can make people look really weird. So that's my recommendation, is you shoot objects and other things with it. Experiment with portraits and see what it looks like. Here we have an example of HDR versus non-HDR, although this is kind of a shitty example, frankly. So how do we actually do this? I'm going to move to my camera and I'm going to show you how to set it up on your digital camera, and then I'll show you the next step in Photoshop. So the first thing to setting up your HDR photos is figuring out if your camera supports HDR. I'm going to go ahead and hit the menu button on the back of my camera, which is just right over here. And I'm going to go to my image shooting settings. Within my shooting settings, I have a bunch of different options, including HDR. And your camera may or may not have this. It's okay if it doesn't. It may also have something called bracketing, which we can use to simulate HDR. So I'm going to do HDR, and I'm going to turn it on. And there's a bunch of different settings in here. You see this? I'm just scrolling through all the different options. There's HDR1, which takes 4 different pictures at once, at different exposures, and composites them. 2 is a super high contrast image. This one is, it takes 3 pictures with 2 exposure difference, meaning it goes +2 and -2 on the exposure chart, so about the limit of what you would typically take. This takes 5 different pictures with the 2 exposure difference. This takes 7 different pictures with the 2 exposure difference, and this takes 3 with a 3 exposure difference, 5 with a 3 exposure, and this just turns it off. So these are going to be the most contrasty, this 3 and this 5 with the 3 exposure difference. So that means it's going to take a picture at 0, a picture at +3, and a picture at -3. If we do 5, it's going to be even more extreme than that. So we could just go with something like HDR1 for now. Get out of this menu. And we're going to just take the picture. And you just heard it shot 3 photos, and then it does this busy. And what it's doing is it's compiling those together. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be a good example because you're looking at my screen. Let me make it a little bit lighter. Shoot again. So it just shot 4 photos. This is also why we want to use a tripod, right? So let's change that HDR setting. So we'll go back in here, go to HDR. Let's change it to 5 at 3 OV. So I don't think the output on that was great. Nope. Let's try again. Yeah, it's not doing a great job compositing it because there's just too much contrast there. And it's just not quite getting it. So you can play around with those HDR settings and get what you want. If you don't have HDR on your camera, if you have bracketing, you might want to use that instead. And what bracketing is, I'm going to turn off HDR. Bracketing is essentially the same thing, but it doesn't automatically put the images together. So HDR, you take 3 or 5 or 7 photos and it puts them all in one. bracketing, they stay as three separate photos. So with bracketing, which I actually love shooting bracketed, bracketing has a bunch of settings like the amount of bracketing. This will take 3 pictures. It'll take one that's +1, one that's 0, one that's -1. We could also do we could do higher levels like 5. We'll stick with the 3. And so what it's going to do is it's going to take 3 photos all at once. So it just took 3 photos. So like one in normal, a little bit brighter, or a little bit darker and a little bit brighter. So there's 3 more photos. We got 1, 2, 3. You can see the normal and the difference. It's pretty subtle in this one. You can kind of create HDR with that. It's not quite the same as actually having proper HDR. Let me open that up again. But the end result is still pretty good. Let's turn on HDR. Let's do HDR2. Again, always want to use a tripod or a flat surface whenever you're shooting HDR. Let's bring these into Photoshop and see what they look like. All right, so I've brought over the photos. I took some outdoor photos, which have a little bit better results than those indoors that I was taking before. And this outdoor photo, this is the non-HDR version, and I'm going to switch to the HDR version. And you can see the difference. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just to 100% on these. So that's 100% zoomed in on this one. We'll do 100% zoomed in on this one. You can see right away the difference in color and contrast. So this is non-HDR and this is HDR. I didn't do any special processing or anything. I just snapped the photo. This is my backyard, and then brought it in, and you can see the stark contrast. In particular, pay attention to the data in the shadows and in the highlights that you get out of these two. This is just using the HDR1 setting, so it's just 3 photos stacked together, but you could get a more dynamic range if you shot on one of the higher settings. If you don't have HDR built into your camera and you've taken 3 pictures, you could even taken those 3 pictures manually. You could have underexposed, taken a picture, exposed, taken a picture, and then overexposed, taken a picture. As long as you don't move much, within Photoshop, if you go File, Automate, and then Merge to HDR Pro, it'll open up this window where you can toss in files or a folder of images and say OK, and it will merge together and create an HDR image for you. It works really, really well. It's actually better than some of the in-camera processors, depending on how old your camera is. So you may have a better time if you want to really shoot some HDR photography, underexposing and taking a bunch of photos, and overexposing and taking a bunch of photos, and then shooting some in the normal range as well. Just don't move the camera and go File, Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. That's the basics of shooting HDR photography. There's a lot more to it as you get more and more advanced, but I wanted to just introduce you to the basics.